companion where we talk about open source and go through the code, where we read the source code. And I'll be hosting today with Christian Smith. Yo! And we are very, very lucky to have Marcy Sutton here today, and she's going to talk about some accessibility and NG-Aria. So Marcy, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Marcy. I am a developer at Substantial in Seattle. And I'm currently working full-time on Angular Material, which is a set of components in Angular using material design, which is a design specification by Google. And I'm working on that, just creating accessible components. So I'm kind of the resident accessibility expert. Part of my work is also keeping tabs on the NG-Aria module, which is a part of Angular 1. And NG-Aria is a module that allows you to inject Aria support into your Angular application. So I add features to that, I bug fix it. It's a pretty cool module.
And for those who don't know, you may have explained it briefly, but what is Aria, and how does it help developers?
Aria is got to put my Aria cap on this morning. Aria is a set of attributes that you can put into your HTML to inject accessibility support. So say you're using a button element. That element has a lot of things that come with it for free, including you can tab to it from the keyboard. You can fire keyboard events from it. All kinds of things. There's other controls like form controls. Say you had a range input in a form. If you were creating that out of divs, it wouldn't have the same semantics. So Aria allows you to fill in the gaps where, say you're creating a custom element and you want it to behave in a screen reader like the native one would. You should always start with the native element, I just have to say. But Aria is a really cool way to add accessibility support to elements that otherwise wouldn't be accessible.
Okay, thank you. And with accessibility too, it's not just about color blindness or specific things. It's it helps everybody, not just screen readers and all that. So when we go through this code, it's going to be foreign to some people and very, very at home with a lot of people who work with it every day. But only recently have you and other champions of accessibility really started creating resources for developers. So thank you.
No problem.
So are we going to go through NG-Aria first?
Sure. Yeah, let me share my screen. I'm going to switch projects. Can you see some, there's two tabs. I can check what you're looking at. Mm-hmm. No, you're still looking at Angular Material.
Perfect.
Let me share a different screen.
Whichever one you want to start with is fine.
Yeah, I figured we'd start with NG-Aria since it's just a single file, and it's kind of easy to reason about because it's all contained in a single module. So just explaining a bit, just a second. I need to close something that's buzzing me. Okay, so NG-Aria was originally contributed by the community on GitHub, and I think people found that they were doing a lot of heavy lifting when the framework should handle it for you. For example, if you put ng disabled, which is a directive in Angular, you can basically use expressions to spit out the disabled attribute, disabling all kinds of things like form elements. I guess that's primarily what disabled is for. But the disabled attribute that the framework is spitting out whenever the ng disabled expression is true only works on certain elements. So the disabled attribute works on an input, or it works on a text area or a checkbox to say, all right, you filled in these fields, now this checkbox is enabled. If you were doing that with a div, the disabled attribute wouldn't actually disable it. If you've ever tried to do things with CSS and found, I guess you can style off of the disabled attribute, But in a screen reader or something, some other kind of assistive technology, there's other things like screen magnifiers, braille displays, like other auxiliary things that people add to their iPhone or to their laptop to basically extend its use as a technology device. If you were putting NG disabled onto a div and it spit out the disabled attribute like it was supposed to, a screen reader wouldn't actually reflect that it was disabled. That's where Aria comes in handy. There's an attribute called aria-disabled, and it takes true or false as a value. And I think developers found with Angular previously that they were having to manage the Aria disabled attribute while the framework was spitting out disabled. So it was kind of like the framework should really be handling that for you. So this module came out of things like that. It came out of people wanting the framework to handle both attributes so that if you're using NG disabled on a div, it will actually become properly disabled in a screen reader. So that's one example of something that Aria or that NG-Aria does for you.
And if people want to take a look at these files while we're talking, these are in the Angular framework for Angular 1X?
They are, yes. So on GitHub, there's the Angular organization, github.com/Angular. The Angular 1 project lives under Angular/Angular.js. Not to be confused with Angular/Angular. That is the Angular 2 organization. Mm-hmm. But the Angular 1 is just Angular.js under the Angular org on GitHub. And that, I guess I can open my, if I open my sidebar in Sublime, we have all of the files that are on GitHub in the left side of my Sublime application. So where you go to find NG-Aria is under source, src, and then there's a folder for NG-Aria, and then aria.js is where the module lives. So one of the things that I wish, I'm happy that NG-Aria is there, but I really wish that it was just part of the core framework, because right now it's an add-on, and you have to download the file or include it like you would the regular Angular framework, and then you have to actually include it as a dependency. And that means that this support is dependent on people actually including the module. But on the flip side, it being modular fits in with the way that other things are handled in Angular. So like NG-Animate is a module, or what are some other ones? NG-Route is a module. So there's precedent for things to be modular. So in that way, it makes sense to me. And it also makes it really easy to test. So NG-Aria, we went and found in the source. I'm also going to look for the test file, because that's another part of this. Where is it? Okay, so in the Angular source code, there's the source folder. There's also the test folder. So if we open that up, NG-Aria has its own directory, and then there's this file called ariaspec.js. And this file is all of the unit tests for NG-Aria. So whenever I go to add a feature, or I want to debug a feature, it's generally when I'm adding something new. I will also open up ariaspec.js, and I will write a test. If you're familiar with test-driven development, this is sort of the approach I'm taking here, but when I'm adding a feature, I will go and write a test and make sure that it fails, just to know for sure like where my starting point is. And then as I add support for this new feature, I'll gradually make the test pass and do some test-driven development to ensure that the thing that I'm adding actually solves a problem. So that's what these two files are. And anytime I'm madly working on an airplane, or to add a feature that I've been thinking about, or at a coffee shop or something, and if you ever see me working on NG-Aria, I typically have these two files open, and that's it.
So for the spec in there, can you talk about the setup, because I saw that was Jasmine or a version of that, right, where you're doing describe and then it should, or it with some explanation. So yeah. What is the I guess the before and after? So when you're running test development, you usually have some setup, and dealing with the views for some people who are coming from Rails or some back-end technology, it's a little more confusing to test front-end. Can we talk about how you set up and how you tear down?
Sure. So this set of tests is part of a larger test framework and or a larger project that already had testing support. So from my perspective, I kind of just got dropped into this world of testing that already existed. So I'm not as familiar with the entire test suite, but I can tell you that this file is, the goal of it is just to test what's in NG-Aria. So to enable that, we have to actually include it as a module. So there's this on line 6, and you can tell I've made edits to this file that aren't committed because I have a D describe. So when I'm testing this to isolate just the Aria test, if I put a D in front of describe in our, I think these are Jasmine tests, that means that it will only run this test suite, so I don't have to sit and wait for all of the other tests, which when you're actually actively developing is really nice. And you can even get more granular. I could add a D in front of a child describe, or I could add an I in front of an it for a single test, and then it will only run that single test, which is a lot easier to work with. But some of these setup things, we have to include NG-Aria as a module, so there's a before each, and then we pass in the module. And I think these tests, there's a lot of utilities and things that make it easy to include a module. There's also, because Angular has so many tests, that they deallocate things. This is, frankly, on the front end, we don't often really worry about memory management, but the Angular tests, because there's so many, they actually have to worry about memory leaks in the tests themselves. And there are some warnings about memory leaks that I've seen in these tests, but the goal of this after each dealloc element is to deallocate the memory for the actual elements that we've created in these tests, so that they get, basically the slate is wiped clean after the tests are run. There's some things about injecting the compiler and the root scope and things that a typical, because we're not actually working with a full application, we have to kind of mock in all of the dependencies that we need. So injecting the scope and the compiler is a way to make it so that you can actually create elements, run them in the way that Angular needs, so that way we can actually get results that are similar to a full application.
Yeah, these are core to the Angular framework, so exactly. You would need them for a lot of these tests for sure.
Yes, and so this ends up being kind of duplicated across all of the tests, but it makes it so that these can be isolated, so that when I run that ddescribe or an I-it, so that when I'm isolating a test, that this spec file has all of the dependencies it needs to actually run independent of the rest of the tests. So that's part of what some of this setup is doing. There's also a utility here for compiling an element so that you can pass it some HTML, like some inner HTML, I should say, compile it into an actual rendered element. I think this is still headless, but you can compile it into an element and then trigger off a digest loop to do the Angular magic. And then there's all sorts of tests in here, setting up, so basically the way that this works is you write a small unit test isolated to the specific element that you're trying to check. So a lot of NG-Aria is about putting Aria attributes onto divs or onto elements that need them. Part of the confusion I saw with NG-Aria in the beginning was that people were playing with it on native inputs, which doesn't really hurt anything, but those inputs already have those semantics. Like a range input already has a minimum and a maximum. It will already communicate to a screen reader. So the goal of this is really to make sure that these attributes are being added to elements that need them. So there's examples of divs with ng-show, and when ng-show is present and it has a truthy value or a false value, it will add aria-hidden of true or false, depending on whether it should be hidden or not. And the goal of this is to really hide contents from a screen reader, because ng-show, it actually has display none by default. So when you're using ng-show to animate something in Angular, the default CSS has display none, which properly hides it from a screen reader. But you can override that CSS. And if you do, that means that it won't actually be hidden from a screen reader. So the goal of NG-Aria is to add aria-hidden, and that will basically make it so that if you have overridden the CSS for ng-show, it will properly hide it. So yeah, there's lots of examples in here. Let's go down to some interesting ones. There's aria hidden for disabled. Aria checked. This one's interesting. So it should attach itself. See, this is not actually necessary. Some of these tests, I think this has been a community effort. So there's tests I've written, there's tests other people have written. Some of them I think are maybe not necessary. Like here's an example. It says aria checked. It should attach itself to input type checkbox. Input type checkbox is already a checkbox and it's already an input, so it actually doesn't need aria checked. So this test could probably go away. Let's see what else is in here.
So how would you use aria checked in that case then? Is there a test case for that?
There is. I'm going to scroll down a little further. Yeah, see, this whole section is actually not necessary now that I'm going back to it. Okay, here's one.
Glad we could help with this refactoring.
Yeah, totally. Actually, yeah, when I find stuff like this, I open up GitHub issues just to track them. And they're there for anyone who wants to pick them up. I tend to be the person to do that because given this is for Angular 1, it is a little bit lower of a priority, to be frank. But some examples of where NG-Aria is really useful. So say I have a div, and if you put role of radio, that's kind of the, this is expecting a developer is actually going to add role of radio, which not sure if they will, but if they do, they can get Aria support hinging off of this one role, which is really awesome. I think it also supports type. So if you put div type checkbox, it will actually go and add the role of checkbox, and it will also add the aria checked, which is really cool. So this is kind of, it's adding support for you where like you only really need to add one attribute. I think that we could probably write better documentation around what these use cases are. But there's a bunch of examples in here. Part of what NG-Aria is looking to do is not attach itself when aria values are already present. So say you're already managing these and you don't want NG-Aria to come in and stomp on the top of the work you've already done. That's part of what the module is doing for you. Okay, so if we scroll down a little farther, we can see roles for custom inputs. So there's some examples. These are ones that I added because I found that if you added a type of checkbox onto a custom element, so this says div. Let's say it said MD checkbox or a material design checkbox. The developer could go and add type of checkbox without knowing what this is for. It should add a role just to make sure that this is actually going to be a checkbox. Let's see, what are some other examples?
And does it make sense to do that because one of the big things is styling form inputs, right? For semantics, it doesn't make sense, but like styling, appearance doesn't always work in CSS for some browsers. So
Yes.
Does it make sense to use a div like this?
I really want to say no, but I know that people do. So
that's fair.
Part of the tension that I feel with this library or this module is that it's basically encouraging bad development practices. And so
how dare you, Marcy?
I know. I go back and forth between how useful this thing is, especially when I go back and look at the tests and what they're actually trying to accomplish and how either edge case they are or they're encouraging things that you shouldn't do, like putting type of checkbox on a div. I don't know. I don't really know why anyone would do that. I think I just found when I was doing testing that NG-Aria was only going part of the way. Like it would add Aria checked in some cases, but not in others. And so to make it go the full distance, I had it also add a role of checkbox. So some of these tests are adding support around features that were already there when the module debuted. So I think it could be gone through with a fine-tooth comb and maybe pruned and documented a little more. I think a lot of the energy, at least in the Angular team, is going towards Angular 2 right now, and so like.
So this wasn't ported as a module for Angular 2?
It's actually not necessary in Angular 2 because they're building a lot of the support into the framework itself. I think we'll.
You got your wish.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's really great. There's already some issues open on GitHub about making sure that roles are added or considered, and like they're obviously thinking about it more for Angular 2. So, who knows? We might want some cool module later on, but as of right now, right out of the gate, I have been told that this just isn't necessary. So anything for Angular 2 would basically be like, I don't know, sugar on top of what's already there, not filling in gaps where they were missing, which is awesome. But some of the cooler things that NG-Aria does are down towards the bottom. So I'm going to keep scrolling. So a lot of what this stuff is doing is checking whether it should actually attach itself to certain kinds of elements. So you don't need aria-disabled on a button or on a select. You only need it on custom inputs. So that's what some of these tests are. And it's actually really interesting to me how much we are able to talk about NG-Aria just by looking at the tests. I think that's.
I've found that the case with really good tests, where you can.
Cool. I mean, and
actually figure out a lot more than you would from docs in some cases.
Yeah, well, and also like we're finding things that aren't really necessary too. So, which you might not be able to tell from looking at the source code that actually does the thing. Like, what are the use cases for that, and like, is that really necessary? And I think we're finding some of the stuff just isn't necessary. But if we keep going, there's a lot of it adding itself to like native inputs, which it actually just doesn't, you don't need that at all.
So is there anything in here for content that, like is Ajaxed in or anything like that? Ooh,
that's a good question. Like checking, like tests that actually check content that's loaded asynchronously?
Yeah, that's one of the harder things I at least when I was doing testing regularly, which I'll soon be doing again, that was one of the things that I found it was hard to stub out effectively was XHR requests and things like that.
That's a really, really good question. Not in these set of tests, there isn't anything for that, but I would definitely be curious to see, does it fall down? That would be pretty cool. So these are a lot of NG-Aria, or just Aria values on form elements. If we continue scrolling down, we start getting into different kinds of things. So there's a short test here for announcing NG messages. So NG messages is another module which I'm actually curious, it doesn't look like NG messages is injected into here, but I think all this is checking. NG-Aria probably doesn't actually need the module to be injected to be able to run the test, because our mock here for some HTML, it has NG messages, and then it's basically just checking whether NG-messages is present at all. It doesn't need the NG messages module to be injected to be able to do that. Whether it would actually show messages and what it would do after that, like if we wrote tests for that, then it would need the dependency.
But those tests would probably live in NG messages, right? So, because something like this you're testing, this is perfect example of, singular purpose, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, it would. I guess that's a good question. If NG-Aria was doing things, and actually this NG messages thing I found is, like, it starts off sort of helpful, but I think NG messages itself needs a bit of work because it announces way too fast. Like it basically assumes that you're wrong before you even type anything. whereas like that's actually pretty annoying. Like
Well, I know directives get prioritized in Angular, so you can actually manually override that. So maybe that's something to look at. Sounds like an icky thing to do, but
yeah,
maybe
well,
looking
I
at
just
something.
found like even visually, like with NG messages, the idea is that it visually spits out error messages when like for form validation, which is really cool, but it's a little bit over-eager. Like visually, it will show you a message like while you are actively typing to change it. I feel like it, and I know they added some debounce to it to try and make it wait a little bit, but I still feel like it's a little bit too fast. When you announce it in a screen reader is when it really exposes how that's way too fast. So I think the best experience would be type something, wait a second, and that's, or just a couple milliseconds, and then show the message. And I think that, like, wait until someone has actually finished typing in the field to actually show the error and announce it.
Hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense, but that's more like of an issue with NG messages itself, not NG-Aria. So if NG-Aria announcing it is too overeager, like, I don't know, that's a question when I go back to the actual architecture of NG messages. And so that's kind of cool, though, to be writing accessibility features and considering how they kind of open up, I don't know, opportunities for improvement in a completely separate module. I think that's pretty cool. And something that we've talked about with NG messages stuff in NG-Aria is that this Aria Live, so there's a concept of live regions. And basically what that does is when you put aria-live of either polite or assertive as a value, when you put that on an element, it means that a screen reader will be listening for changes on that element so that when you append text to it, it will just automatically be read into a screen reader, which for NG messages is pretty easy because NG messages just shows and hides messages as form validation. By putting Aria Live on that wrapper element, which the wrapper is always there, it's rendered, and then the messages inside of it come and go. And as they come and go, that's how a screen reader will, because of the Aria Live, it will announce those. The utility uses the assertive value by default because when you're writing a validation message, you kind of need to know right away as you're typing whether you made a mistake. And if it's polite, which is the other setting, then it's waiting for everything to be done. So it's not going to interrupt any other screen reader messages. From my perspective, as a user filling out a form, I thought the quicker feedback would be like cognitively, it would be tied to what you're actually typing instead of like waiting a second. But I have gotten feedback that people would like this to be configurable so that they can choose the level. So that's something that we've talked about. I think NG messages, the solution just needs work in general, so that would go along with that stuff.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Can we see some of the how the code take a test example and then go to the actual code for that test so we can see kind of what we want to do?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm going to go over to Aria.js. I'm just to make this quick. I'm just going to search for NG messages and then go through all the mentions of it and then create directive NG messages. So what NG-Aria does is it just like injects additional support into the original directive. So the way this actually is interesting to me, and I learned a lot about Angular just by seeing how this was set up before I got onto it. So you would think that by declaring a directive more than once, that it would probably overwrite it, but it actually just adds on top of it. So NG-Aria is taking the NG messages directive, which is an attribute, and it requires the original, I guess this is why it doesn't stomp over the top of it, is that it has this require statement with a question mark and then NG messages. So it's requiring the original directive. And then in the linking function, we can include NG messages if we needed to get access to it as a controller. And all this does in NG-Aria for NG messages support, it checks if Aria Live is not already present because we don't want to overwrite that. If it isn't already present, it just adds the attribute of aria-live of assertive. So if we were going to make this configurable, let me find another example of a configure property. So we have one down here in the ng-click. So if I paste this here, aria.config, we could name this whatever. So what this is doing is it's looking up into the configuration for NG-Aria, because you can tell NG-Aria whether or not you want specific features to be added. So it could be ng messages, it could be live, maybe it's like ng message level, or like one of the hardest things in computer science is naming things, right? So it could be, this is the kind of thing where I'd want to go and ask people maybe, or I would spend some time thinking about what the actual config property would be. But what this would do is, instead of just hard coding assertive, it would go and check the configuration for the level the end developer included, and then it would just inject that instead. So if we go up and look at the config, I'm going to go all the way up to the top. Scroll down, nice and slow. So here's an example of in the comments, and these comments actually get spit out as documentation. It shows you how to include NG-Aria as a dependency, and sorry if this is harder to read than the actual source code, but the Aria Provider is the mechanism with which you can actually add configuration values. So if we were going to add ng message level, if we wanted to change that to polite, in the config, and we tend to do true or false, actually, so that we don't open up the config to values that it doesn't expect. So maybe ng message assertive, and then making this false so that it's polite by default, maybe that would be better. And then in here we would go ng message assertive, make that true by default so that it's always assertive. And then down in the actual code, we would check that config and say like which value the user selected. But the idea is that this config, and I've had some discussion whenever I have a pull request for stuff like this, we often talk a lot about what we're opening up to the developer in the config, and we want to make sure that we're not releasing something out there that's going to be really hard to change later. Like adding an array into the config of elements that you can apply ng-click to. Or like I've had all kinds of ideas of like, oh yeah, let's just add an array and they can select the elements. And I always get pushback of like, that'll be really hard to change later. And I think by making things just true or false, it only works for cases where there's two options. Most of these are just checking whether or not you want NG-Aria to do the thing at all. So that's part of the challenge, is like making it configurable but not opening it up for errors. So yeah, this is part of what goes into developing for NG-Aria.
I didn't even realize that about Angular. That's pretty cool. I know, because like having built a lot of jQuery plugins, like the ons that you pass in that hash just seems to get way out of control way fast.
Totally.
Like stuff like that. So I could totally see changing that would be a nightmare.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and this, Angular just has so much adoption that like any release gets used. Like that's part of what's exciting about this stuff, is like people are actually using this module. Part of what's also challenging is when you introduce a bug, which has happened. Because of the nature of what we're trying to do with NG-Aria, which is add support for divs and other non-interactive elements, those do not work the same cross-browser. I've learned a lot about keyboard events. Just basically, I figured out why accessibility folks always say, start with the native element. Start with the native element, start with the native element. And I figured out that the reason is because it's way more predictable when you're using a button instead of a div. And so I came in here with all this energy to try and make NG-Aria fix problems, and then I found that I was causing more problems by trying to fix problems. So with that, I want to show you the ng-click directive. I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom. So two of the directives that NG-Aria hooks into are ng-click and ng-double-click. And a widespread problem across Angular applications is that ng-click is really easy to put on any kind of element. You could put it on the body. You could put it on a div. I think div is probably the most common that I've seen. So one of the things I really wanted NG-Aria to do was to make those clicks accessible. It's kind of arguable, like that was a really good idea, but then you're like the developer is taking the step to include NG-Aria as a dependency, so obviously they care a little bit. If they care that much, why aren't they just using a button element? And these are all questions that I ask myself while I'm developing this stuff. But I still came back to the clicks are already there. If I can make those accessible by just including a dependency, that's pretty cool. So part of what NG-Aria does now is it checks what kind of element ng-click is attached to. And then there's this node blacklist of elements that we don't want to add additional keyboard support because they already work. So the idea is that ng-click on a button will fire from the keyboard when you tab onto it. Like if you tab onto a button, hit enter or spacebar. I think spacebar is actually native for a button. But if you do that with ng-click, it will fire a callback. If you put the same ng-click on a div, even if it has Tabindex of 0, which NG-Aria actually adds for you, if you tabbed onto it, it wouldn't fire from the keyboard. So that was a huge problem. Like NG-Aria added Tabindex to divs when ng-click was present, or ng-module, but it wouldn't actually go all the way. So you had to also add ng-keypress. So what this is doing is it's checking if it's not one of these elements, and we have a pretty cool function here of checking whether the element that you're looking at is in this array. Is the node one of things in that array? And this is actually the array I mentioned a little earlier in the config. I thought it might be cool to make this configurable, and I got pushback of like, we don't actually want to open it up that much. And so all this does is if it's not one of those elements, it adds a role to it, because if you're clicking on it, and this is pretty heavy-handed, I will admit, but it actually makes it so that if you put ng-click on a div and the user tabs onto it, it will be announced as a button, and then they know that they can click on it, or they can use the keyboard to click it. So this is the bit about Tabindex I mentioned. This was already here. This is probably, I think this is the only thing that ng-click did in NG-Aria when I got onto it. But it adds Tabindex. Like I said, that only went part of the way there for a div. So what it also does is it binds keypress. So if it's not one of those elements, we're going to bind a key down. And this is the bug that I mentioned that got introduced. It didn't actually check whether it was a button element before. A button element actually fires a click from the keyboard, which is what makes it really hard to do this stuff for, was that it basically had 2 events on it. So if you had a button, it was firing 2 events. And I saw that come up in Angular material. I saw it come up in Angular, like there were issues reported about it. So people noticed this bug. It was a big problem. And so the code got updated to check what kind of element it is.
So this is the fixed code then, right?
This is the fixed code, yeah. There was also some work done to make sure that local parameters were passed through and then passed into the callback, like the event object. And so, yeah, I learned so much about, cross-browser, not native element support, and passing, when you're basically passing callbacks around and passing their parameters around. This was stuff that was new to me, so it was definitely a group effort to get this thing to work. But what it does now is if you put ng-click on a div, it will do all this magic to make it accessible for you. Which, admittedly, if you just used a button, we wouldn't have had to write all this stuff. But it was a problem that existed on the web, so I'm really happy that this is actually trying to solve a problem.
I didn't even think of that too. Like I'm like, why would we make a click accessible? And as you explained it, I'm like, oh yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, I mean, part of this was like, and this is that tension I mentioned earlier, which is, I don't want to encourage people to put ng-click on a div, but it's already been done. It's already out there. So how can we make the web more accessible by accepting that this is the way that people write code in Angular? And I think it's a real shame that that is the way it is, but I've just accepted it. And if we can write smarter frameworks, I think the best thing that could have happened was if they restricted what you could put ng-click on. And I'm hoping, I guess, native JavaScript isn't any different. You could bind a click onto a div, but I think ng-click originally was messaged that it was just easy to put it on anything. So without documentation telling you that it's a bad idea to put it on a div, you're going to probably do it anyway. So there's all these things that I think about when I'm writing this code. So yeah, ng-click is the only one that really goes that far. ng-double-click will add Tabindex. So if we look down below, there's the directive for ng-double-click. That is what ng-click looked like when I started with this. All it did was add Tabindex, which means that you can tab onto the div from the keyboard, but that's all it will do. It won't change the role of it. It won't fire it from the keyboard. But I decided that was kind of a can of worms when it comes to double-click. Like, what exactly should that do from the keyboard? So given that it's, I don't know, I haven't seen it used quite as much in the wild, ng-click was really the one that needed this kind of support.
And just to verify, when you add tab index 0 to something, does that give it focus, or what's the purpose of it?
Yes, exactly. So it means that you can focus onto the element. Did I lose you?
Not at all.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, it means that the element can take focus, which that comes by default with buttons, anchors, text inputs, text areas. That's what's in our node blacklist for ng-click. It's all the elements that already are accessible from the keyboard. Admittedly, there's probably others that we could add, like the details element, or the new, it's basically an HTML5 accordion that's not quite fully in use yet, but it's still an interesting element. So we could expand this node blacklist so that it's not overwriting the native behavior. But these were the more common ones that we wanted to make sure we weren't overwriting native semantics and we weren't adding additional clicks. So yeah.
Very cool. So that's NG-Aria.
Yes.
And we have about like 10 more minutes or so. Do you want to go through any other code examples, or do we want to keep going with NG-Aria?
We could look around Angular Material a little bit. I have that project.
Yeah, that was a big project you were.
Yeah, I'm actually still on it, which is really cool. I'm going to share a different screen. That is, are we still looking at, which one are you looking at? Let's see. Yes, I hid it. This is fun. I get to show you my face again. Okay. So another project that I'm working on is Angular Material. And this is also under the Angular organization on GitHub. It's just github.com/angular/material. And this is a set of components built in Angular to express the material design library or specification. So things like buttons that have a certain style to them, or form inputs that are in the material design style.
And these are Angular directives, Angular 1x, right?
Yes, there is a parallel effort happening with Angular 2. It's a much smaller team. I think only one person is working on it. But we like, I'm syncing up with him every so often just to look at the accessibility story for that and make sure that it's looking good, but that is happening kind of alongside the Angular 1 project. We are working towards our 1.0 to make this stable and very usable. So trying to get in all the breaking changes now before 1.0, and we have a lot of user feedback on GitHub, so it's definitely a work in progress, but our goal is to get to 1.0 sometime this summer, and that way that it'll be a stable library that people can work with. It's definitely the most accessible material design implementation, which I'm pretty happy I've gotten to put my stamp on. But let's take a look at the source code. So I have the sidebar open in Sublime, and we use npm and Bower to pull in any dependencies that we need for the project. Part of what's been cool and challenging is working on a project that is a framework, but also a website. So there's the docs website, which is material.angularjs.org. And I work on that a lot, making that site accessible, writing documentation, all those kinds of things. And there's some improvements to that site coming. But then there's also the components. So the doc site is written with the components. There's some custom ones, but we try to use the components that we're building to make sure that they work. So in the Angular material repository, there's the docs folder, and that's where the actual docs application lives, and I live in there quite often. But the actual components are under source components, and this is where things like toolbars and tabs and radio buttons and checkboxes and all of these components, that's where they all live. And then there's also a folder for core things like services, the styles like our typography that we just added, things like the layout, which we use Flexbox, which was really cool to get to learn as well on this project. But one service I was going to show you is the Aria Service, which does some really cool stuff to make sure that icon buttons have labels. Things like radio buttons and checkboxes. Like say you had a checkbox that doesn't have a visual label next to it, to make sure that it's accessible, in addition to the Aria role of checkbox and Aria checked and all these things that we add, and we actually use NG-Aria under the hood in Angular material. So that's been pretty cool. I get to add features to NG-Aria, and then they get consumed by my other project.
And the advantage to making this a service in Angular, my understanding is it's just easier to share across components, correct?
Exactly, yeah. So it makes it reusable, makes it really easy to call methods on the service. So we have an Aria service that's used, like the example I had just now was the checkbox. And an example would be, like, we just added clickable list items. And so the idea with these is it's like on your iPhone or a Nexus device, where if you go into the settings and you'll have a list item that the whole row might be clickable, but then it might also have a toggle on the side. So there's like multiple controls in a single list item. If you had a checkbox on the right side as the little toggle, if that didn't actually have a visual label as part of the component, we want to enforce, because it's the web and we want people to be able to use these from screen readers, to make sure that you don't forget the label. We actually, there's documentation telling you to do this, but there's also a console log statement that we print out in the browser, so that when you're developing and you include this and you forget to add the Aria label, this Aria service will actually, it will check. So that's this, if we look at this Aria service, there's this method called expect, and it gets past the element so that you can actually check what's on it. And then the attribute that we're looking for, which I think this is only really used for Aria label, which is Aria-label, and all that does is it will add an accessible name to. Hello. I think I lost you guys.
Hey, not sure what happened. The Hangout seemed to break there.
It took a little timeout, huh?
Yeah, I think we're still broadcasting though.
Okay, cool. So I was talking about how we check whether we should actually console log that you forgot a label. And so what this code does is it checks for the attribute. If you didn't supply it, then we check the child elements, and if none of those have text or a ARIA label, then if there's text, if we as framework developers know what the fallback text could be, then we try to inject that. And if we've already tried to do like 2 or 3 things. If there's still nothing we can use to label it, that's when we spit out ARIA attribute, and then whatever. We made this reusable, but it's really only the ARIA label. Say that this attribute is required for accessibility and it's missing on, and then we spit out the node to tell you which element. So in the console, you can actually right-click, go and inspect the element that's missing a label. And so this has, I think, gone a long way to telling developers when they forgot something. And I've gotten a little pushback of people saying, how do I turn the warnings off? And I kind of joke around and say, well, read what it's telling you and add a label. But if there are bugs with it, we want to know. So if it's spitting out the warning even when it already has the attribute or things like that, we've tried to work through those bugs because they did come up at certain times, but I'm pretty sure that it works as expected now. But if you do find a bug, let us know on GitHub.
Is there a default thing for $log where you can just say don't show log messages that way?
Oh, maybe change the config for $log.
Yeah, pretty much.
You could probably do that, but I don't want to tell people that. I want them to add labels.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you can't do that.
No, we want people to, the goal of it, and it's not like it's spitting it out into the actual site. So if it makes it into production, only nerds or developers are going to find these console log statements. Admittedly, that's pretty late. If it's spitting it out to the console and you still don't know, it's kind of the last resort. I think ideally you'd catch it earlier. Another thing we probably could have looked at is the Protractor plugin that I wrote. So there's an Angular end-to-end testing framework called Protractor, and I recently wrote a plugin for that for accessibility that will run your code through the Chrome accessibility developer tools, the audit rules that they use for the browser extension, as well as Tenon, which is an accessibility testing platform. And you can choose if you want to use one or both of those test platforms, but those services, that will actually catch these things before you deploy to production or before it's actually in a browser. So I think these combinations of tools are going to help improve the accessibility of the web. But admittedly, a console log statement is probably too late.
Yeah, I noticed on the Chromium bugs, there's been a lot of activity with implementing the accessibility debugger inside of the actual Chrome dev tools. So
yes,
that should help for Chrome at least too.
Totally. Yeah, Alice Boxhall is working on that. I've been talking to her. She'll sometimes post progress or ask how would this work for accessibility people who actually use those features. But I'm really excited to see that go mainstream because I use that extension all the time. The Chrome accessibility developer tools are awesome because you can just run an audit in your browser, check if say you use the attribute aria-role. That's actually incorrect. It should just be role and then a value. But it looks like it could be right. It's one outlier that doesn't have aria- as a prefix. So it's an easy mistake to make. There's other ones if you say you're putting a role of image on something and you spell I am AGE instead of IMG. Those are easy mistakes that you could have the best of intentions and actually know about Aria, and you could still overlook that. So those are the kinds of things that automated tools can help us catch.
Hopefully we'll catch the IMAG before it gets to production.
Yeah, I did that one. I didn't even realize it because you're typing out the word image but it's actually it's actually looking for the tag name. But
well, I think SVG even has like a image, like I am AGE, right? Doesn't it, or some
see?
other piece?
Okay, so like it's admittedly really confusing, and I think that's part of what makes it challenging. So if automated tools can be, we'll let them do the heavy lifting and be the ones to boss us around, because like even for people who work with Aria every day, there are some things in it that are challenging. So part of my mission to make accessibility more mainstream and make it easier for people is to write tools and find methods to actually help debug these things easier, so that you don't have to be an expert.
Well, that's great. We're running out of time now, so thank you, Marcy, for sharing all this stuff with us. Where can people find you and also contribute to these projects, and where is the code that people can read through?
Yes, so you can find me on Twitter at Marcy Sutton. You can find Angular on GitHub at github.com/angular/angular.js. That's Angular 1. Angular 2 is Angular/Angular. Not confusing at all. Angular material is github.com/angular/material or at material.angularjs.org. And then the Protractor project is just github.com/angular/protractor. And then if you look in the plugins, you'll find the accessibility plugin.
Did you mention the Chrome extension?
Oh yes, the Chrome extension is also on GitHub. That's where I got the audit rules from. I think that's under the Google Chrome organization, and if you just search Chrome Accessibility Developer Tools, you can find the browser extension and you can find the GitHub repository. And all of these projects, because they're on GitHub, they're all open source. You can contribute. We definitely welcome GitHub issues, and pull requests can be helpful. I think some projects aren't looking for unsolicited pull requests, but GitHub issues, by all means, are totally a great way to contribute. And if you find a bug or you have an idea for a feature, we'd love to hear about it.
And if anyone sees a contributing.md or something in the README that tells you specific rules, take a look at those on any of the repositories we cover on this show.
Definitely, yeah. You want to read the contributing guidelines to make sure that you're actually being helpful.
Okay. Well, I got to run.
Thank
you so much, Marcy. This has been really educating. Every time I talk with you about accessibility, I feel like more and more. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a